One can enjoy movies without looking for their deeper meanings. Movies are, after all, first and foremost a visual medium, offering up splendor far beyond what we witness in our day-to-day lives. A powerful musical score and sound design can leave a lasting impact as well. You can probably hear these scenes even though it's been years since you saw them last. Even beyond the raw aesthetic qualities of a movie, well-constructed moments can draw genuine emotion, all without requiring the viewer to grapple with any perceived or intended meaning of the work. Such is the case for countless quality movies, but such is not the case for Snowpiercer. Snowpiercer puts the thematic conflict front and center, essentially impossible to ignore, and it has my utmost respect for it. For while some may criticize it for being too on-the-nose or heavy-handed, it centers the thematic conflict so loudly perhaps because the vast majority of its audience are so completely inured to the ideology at the heart of the conflict that they do not consider questioning it as thematically serious. Surely the meaning of the work lies elsewhere, they protest. This $40 million production can't possibly be saying that. And yet, despite their misgivings, their eyes are uncomfortably drawn at least in the correct direction, even if not at the point itself. Don't get me wrong, it's still very possible to completely miss what Snowpiercer is getting at, although it requires a thematic blindness on the order of, well, I guess Jake Gyllenhaal just really hates spiders. I'm sure an unfortunately sizable number of people interpreted the dumbest possible version of the message, specifically, society bad. The bulk of people, though, I would reckon, got that it had something to do with capitalism and class, which is definitely the correct neighborhood of the point. I fit into this category for many years until a rewatch clarified the exact point to me beyond any reasonable doubt. Now, I'm not one of those movies are puzzles to be figured out kind of guys, but I put to you that Snowpiercer is testing a very, very specific thematic claim. Understanding that claim leads to a much greater enjoyment of the whole work. Not understanding that claim is why so many people dislike the ending, myself included for a time. So before we continue, I want to give you a final chance to thematically engage with Snowpiercer on your own terms, untainted by the confines of my reading. It's a good movie. Great, even. Definitely worth a rewatch. And there's a pretty high chance, based on what I've said already, you'll see what the movie is getting at on a close viewing. Alright then, all aboard. I'll spare you the traditional YouTube watch time padding repetition of every damn thing that happens in the movie, and get right down to it. To start, what is the train anyway, symbolically speaking? The answers people generally come to are society, perhaps even humanity. And one can be forgiven for thinking that, as the train has all the hallmarks of our contemporary form of societal organization. The poor and their miserable lots in life, the rich with their unimaginable opulence. But it's something far more specific. It is capitalist society condensed. It definitely speaks to the ideological gravity of capitalism that so many see and accept the train as interchangeable with humanity writ large. The engine of the train is, as one would expect the driving force of capitalist society to be, capitalism itself. The movie is not subtle about this, likely for the aforementioned reasons.
What happens if the engine stops? We all freeze and die. But will it stop or will it stop? No, no! Can you tell us why? The engine is eternal, yes! The engine is forever, yes! Rumble, rumble, rattle, rattle, who is the reason why? We'll find ya!
Capitalism is often described by its defenders as an engine of prosperity, lifting people out of poverty, of growing the wealth of the middle class. Yet the prosperity generated by capitalism is not shared by all, in ways that become increasingly more obvious with each passing year. Capitalism requires considerable sacrifice on behalf of the working class. Sacrifices certainly not shared by the beneficiaries of the system. One of the saddest truths of Snowpiercer is that the way the privileged view the engine, in contrast to the material harms required to keep the engine going, is not that far removed from reality. And yet, even with these accelerating sacrifices to the engine, the train is by no means a stable society. The symbolic precarity of the train is visually communicated when it violently rocks side to side and is almost derailed, irrespective of anything any character of the film is doing. This is not merely a cute visual effect to amp up the action of the scene. This symbolizes the tendency of capitalist society to be in perpetual crisis. It serves as an example of where it manages to right itself and survive the crisis, yes, but clearly serves as a contrast to the crisis it does not survive later on in the ending. One wonders how much longer the train could even keep going, even without the events of the movie. On that note, something about the train that I believe is overlooked from a thematic perspective is the world that it exists in. The dead, frozen Earth outside of the train is more than just a plot contrivance to keep everybody on board. For one thing, it actually changes over the course of the movie. It is laid bare in this blink and you'll miss it scene. This scene stuck out to me the first time I watched the movie. I almost thought it was an editing mistake to leave in because it felt like it had nothing to do with trainly matters. But this is, low-key, one of the most important scenes in the movie in understanding the ending, both literally and thematically. Hence, them calling back to it before the final confrontation of Wilford.
해피 뉴 이어 할 때마다 내가 꼭 보는 게 있거든. 거기 잘 보면 추락한 역에 끼한 데가 계곡에 거꾸로 처박혀 있어. 한 10년 전인가? 그땐 우리 나에게 푸른만 얼음 위로 살짝 드러나 보였는데 지금은 비행기 몸통이랑 앞날개까지 점점 더 드러나 보여.
The world around them is changing. In the beginning of the movie, the deadly cold is used to denote a clear lack of the possibility of life outside the train. The movie itself explicitly spells out that all life outside the train is extinct. The cold is even used to remove a tail sectioner's arm, perhaps symbolizing how poverty and deprivation are the threatened consequences of trying to exist outside of capitalism. The darkening of the sky meant the purported end of all potential for life outside the train, and symbolically, the perceived end of any alternatives to capitalism. It is from this perspective that essentially all the denizens of the train exist. This encapsulation of capitalist realism, that this is the only possible way to structure society. The school car scene, besides being a delightfully ham way to establish Wilford's backstory, offers a reminder of how systems gain their feelings of inevitability. As they say, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Even beyond the overt propagandizing, they do have evidence they can point to for their beliefs. Evidence right outside their window, as they pass the still frozen corpses of a failed movement to escape the confines of the train. Symbolically, I probably don't have to tell you what this represents. This is your uncle ranting about Venezuela. This is every purportedly failed attempt to build a society without capitalism being the core consideration. Much like many of the examples commonly brought up in real life, it's by no means an honest comparison. This failed movement didn't have the luxury of choosing where and with what resources they jumped off the train with, and they faced tremendous resistance. Moreover, the ending such that it is reveals this to be a cherry-picked counterexample to the train's prevailing ideology. All that said, it's not hard to see why the denizens of the train, particularly those in places of privilege, never think to question the train, and in fact relish the failure of this movement. For them, it justifies the hierarchy and their place atop it, seeing those who attempt to leave the hierarchy fail. It is not unlike centrist Democrats relishing the failure of more left-leaning candidates, seeing left-leaning losses as evidence of the correctness of their comfortable status quo beliefs. But that's another video. The compliance of the non-tail denizens of the train is universal, irrespective of their different roles. From Wilford and his loyal blue checks sitting at the head of the hierarchy, to the state violence-relishing enforcers, to even the guy making the bug snacks. You'll note how none of the people in these roles even slightly question the hierarchy of the train, because they enjoy privileged positions relative to the poverty of the tail sectioners. They enjoy the material privilege and prestige of being on top of somebody, anybody in the hierarchy. The noteworthy exception being the children who serve in the engine. Their compliance is driven by a complete breaking of the spirit. Yet even within this rigid hierarchy of the train, there is a nod to the real-life concept of upward mobility, in the example of the violin player plucked from the tail section. Note, however, the limits of this mobility. It is mobility only when the dominant class desires it, and extremely fragile. Note carefully here that he is playing on the last violin string, presumably in the entire train, and when it snaps, so too is his time in the front of the train likely over. One has to wonder though, were his position more secure, would he ever have given a single thought to his former life on the tail section? Having gone from initially refusing the call because they wouldn't take his wife with him, he now shines proudly in the front of the train. Such is the blinding power of material privilege. While the tail sectioners question the distribution of goods and services throughout the train, the only one who meaningfully questions the train itself is Nam. He implores Curtis to blow open the door that everybody on the train has internalized to be a wall. Curtis calls him crazy.
And freeze to death? What are you, fucking crazy?
This, again, mirrors real life in the experiences of leftists trying to get others to question capitalism. Curtis didn't initiate the revolution to derail the train. He did it to get a better lot in life for the tail sectioners. On a more selfish level, perhaps he did it to rid himself of the guilt of what he did to survive in the early days of the train. More pressingly, he did it to get back the stolen children of the tail section. It is this clear injustice more than anything else that spurs Curtis and the tail sectioners to begin their uprising. It goes without saying that there's no democracy on the train. Nobody elected Wilford. But even if there were elections, would the denizens of the front of the train ever be convinced to vote in the interests of the tail section? Could meaningful change within the confines of the train ever be achieved through some kind of electoralism? No, almost certainly not, even if the tail sectioners could vote. Certainly the choice to abandon the train itself would never be on the ballot. Yet one can't help but wonder, would they still have begun the revolution if they had had a mollifying democratic placebo to give them false hope for reform? Regardless, what the tail sectioners didn't know is that the revolution itself is a planned aspect of the train. Encouraged and set in motion by confirmed fake leftist FBI CIA asset Gilliam at the behest of Wilford. Gilliam, who is made to bear responsibility for the deaths of the residents of the front of the train. Notably, the only deaths Wilford actually cares about. The uprising is designed only to thin the population of the tail section. It is less a revolution, more a rotation of the sordid gears of an existing system. The callousness of Wilford arbitrarily sparing lives to celebrate a milestone punctuates how little regard he and his system have for human life.
Oh, wait. Spare 18 to celebrate our 18th year.
It's an excellent idea, yes.
Your people.
Meanwhile, the beneficiaries of the system are ignorant at best of these murders, more likely knowingly complacent, quietly along for the ride, looking the other way, happy with their lots in life. In our free market capitalist society, human sacrifices for the benefit of the privileged are nothing new. It's becoming increasingly obvious with the advent of dystopian terms like essential workers, to say nothing of underpaid nurses and other healthcare professionals being compensated in heroic platitudes while they put their lives on the line. But even beyond these particularly trying times, it's important to never forget that the first purpose of the American healthcare system has always been to make money, not to improve public health. This unspoken distinction has caused untold amounts of suffering. Make no mistake, millions of people's lives and livelihoods are sacrificed in the name of extracting wealth. Yet the body count of capitalism is well hidden away from the mainstream, written off as expected lower-class suffering from which they can escape if they just try hard enough. It is no big surprise in that context that Wilford comes off as cartoonishly evil. His real-life equivalents would never say that quiet part out loud. Anyway, much to the bemused surprise of Wilford, the revolution makes it the entire length of the train to the door of the engine. At this point, Wilford, far from feeling defeated, his faith in the system complete, opens the door and has Claude forcibly invite Curtis in for dinner. Now I know I said I wasn't going to do the whole play-by-play thing, but essentially everything that happens after Curtis enters the engine is important enough to warrant discussion. To start, it's interesting that Wilford opens the door from a thematic perspective. If anything, I think it represents that any within-the-system discussion of reform will always happen on the terms of capital, with capital in the driver's seat. Wilford warmly greets Curtis and tells him he's the first to walk the full length of the train. That in effect, he's the first person to fully rise through the class structure, from the tail to the engine, saying that Curtis has more perspective than anybody, and highlighting how historic it is that he is with him in the engine now. Curtis chides Wilford for never visiting the tail section, citing its miserable conditions. Wilford retorts that,
Do you think my station is without its own drawbacks? It's noisy. And it's lonely.
Right.
this is a great line in that it exactly mirrors the painfully out-of-touch kind of person without material problems that you see everywhere in the modern political discourse. They center their own experience and downplay or utterly ignore those who have real material hardship. Curtis again points out Wilford's insanely privileged life, and Wilford rhetorically shifts to a defense of the hierarchy of the train. The outright defense of hierarchy is less common in the discourse because it gives away the game, that the defender believes in the concept of economic in-groups who are worthy and out-groups who are not, rather than merely pretending the system works for everyone. Curtis is having none of it, and comments that,
That's what people in the best place say to people in the worst place.
and that
There's not a soul on this train who wouldn't trade places with you.
Wilford then makes the offer, in a conversational manner.
Would you trade places with me?
Curtis, either believing this to be a joke or otherwise firm in his convictions, responds in the negative.
Fuck you.
Wilford, somewhat taken aback, retorts that we are all prisoners in this hunk of metal, notably framing the plight of everyone as equal despite the obvious inequities. What's implied here is the argument that we are all members of capitalist society and there's no escaping or reforming it, so why shouldn't I live it up? Why shouldn't you live it up? Wilford then changes tracks, informing Curtis about Gilliam's aforementioned complicity, that the revolution was an op to reduce the population, as were all attempted revolutions in the train. I'll note Wilford makes a particularly deranged remark about not having the patience for natural selection, as if it has any bearing whatsoever on their existence, stating in effect that such cruelties are necessary for the train to function, in a suitably bloodless billionaire libertarian way.
The next best solution is to have individual units kill off other individual units.
You'll note the disconnect in how he frames the system here in terms that are ostensibly class-neutral, if utterly dehumanizing, but in practice all the casualties fall squarely on one side. This is a staple of many reactionaries' discourse, pretending that the systems that govern society are in any way blind to such dimensions as class or race. This contradiction is further explored when Wilford highlights that the front suffered more losses than anticipated, giving away the game that realistically, the front was never meant to suffer to any meaningful extent in the revolutions. Wilford then orders the execution of most of the tail sectioners, taunting Curtis. Curtis pounds the table. Claude fires her pistol to keep him in check. Wilford, fearing damage to the engine, loses his composure for the first and only time in this scene.
God damn it, Claude! Mind the engine!
Claude, liberal scold that she is, reprimands him as if he were a child.
Sit down and mind your table manners.
Meanwhile, while this is going on, Nam and Yona wake up outside the door to the engine. Nam is forced to fight back against the front section's socialites whom he bogarted Chronol from. It's notable that this mob is every bit the deranged, whacked-out rabble that the front sectioners accuse tail sectioners of being. Or, on a more symbolic level, the sins the wealthy classes project onto the working class, being guilty of them themselves. They are seemingly bereft of reason, fighting presumably only for drugs. Nam instructs Yona to open the door to the engine while he fights them back. It's no easy task to bypass a door given how many cables there are. This could potentially be read on a symbolic level as the difficulty older generations of people disapproving of capitalism face in connecting their lived experiences to those of younger generations. But this may be a stretch, admittedly. Back in the engine, Wilford pontificates about the environment of anxiety, fear, chaos, and horror required to keep the train going. This is none too subtly analogous to the same kind of tools often utilized to great effect in our contemporary politics. In the absence of the possibility of material policy gains, all kinds of emotional manipulation are on the table to shore up the legitimacy of those in power, tailor-made to what their bases want to hear. It is also the horror of material deprivation that forces people to keep fulfilling their role as the exploited underclass required to keep capitalism going. Wilford then gives Curtis his first taste of the privilege that could come with his new life, the privilege of being alone. It breaks him in seconds, the relief of it all after a permanently crowded life in the tail section, and he falls to his knees. This could also be seen as Wilford inviting Curtis to think only of himself, to accept Wilford's individualistic perspective, and forget about the collective good he ostensibly has been fighting for. Wilford then returns to Curtis and more directly and earnestly makes him the offer, inviting him to take his place at the head of the hierarchy, tending the engine, building him up and placing the whole of humanity, all the people of the train, under his purview. Curtis doesn't say anything. Yona finally gets the engine door open, and Claude exits the engine to investigate. Yona knocks her out with a bottle. Nam then has her set the chronal bomb and tells her to get matches to light it from Curtis. She pleads with Curtis for them, but he refuses her. In this moment, Wilford has won. Curtis has accepted his new role and is ready to be part of the train, with no interest in the more radical revolution proposed by Nam, perhaps not even the reforms he began the revolution for. Fortunately, this does not last. Yona senses something under the floor of the car. A child surrounded by horrific engine parts manually unclogging the engine. Wilford puts the floor panel back down as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He justifies the child working there, saying that the part that used to do that job went extinct, laughably stating that while the engine lasts forever, not all of the parts will. This also hints at the nature of the engine he worships as being something outside of the physical one moving the train, but instead something more metaphorical. After all, how could something be said to last forever that is in constant need of maintenance? Especially maintenance whose price is paid by the lives of children. Anyway, Curtis, having now seen what the system requires, finally makes the correct choice. Curtis's anger here is twofold, not merely at Wilford for this depraved abuse of children, but also at himself for essentially accepting Wilford's offer previously, despite everything that Wilford had done. Curtis then selflessly attempts to rescue the child, shoving his arm into the machine to stop it, desperately trying to reach him. Most importantly, he gives Yona the matchbook, implicitly now agreeing with Nam that the train is no longer tenable, risks be damned. He has seen firsthand what the train requires, and not only does he not want to be part of it, he is ready to end it. A second tail section boy, Andy, leaves a crawl space and enters the core of the engine, despite Curtis's pleas. One can only wonder how many other children are used in the engine. Finally, Yona lights the bomb. Nam breaks the neck of the seemingly unstoppable pursuer, and Curtis tries again to get the kid out of the crawl space. This leads to the conclusion of Curtis's arc. Having failed to previously offer his arm to allow others to survive during the early days of the train, he has now selflessly lost an arm, and can now begin to assuage that guilt, however briefly. Nam enters the engine and tries to flip the switch to close the door behind him to shield everyone from the blast, but this is unsuccessful. Potentially because of Yona's bypass, but Nam's look of surprise leads me to believe this could perhaps be a final sort of vengeance by the train itself on those who would attempt escape. Nam desperately tries to close the door manually, but this does not work either. Nam and Curtis then envelop Yona and the rescued child in their arms to protect them with their very bodies, a final symbolic sacrifice such that they may live on. At this point, Wilford mutters his last word.
Nice.
It's hard to say if this is a sarcastically detached rebuke of the seeming sentimentality of their embrace, or a genuine statement of admiration that they were able to do what he didn't have the moral clarity to do in confronting the train. Maybe a statement of despair as his life's work was undone. Perhaps it's some permutation thereof. Maybe he just saw his favorite number. Whatever the case, it's one of my favorite last lines in cinema. In a way, this defeat of Wilford could also be seen as a repudiation of the great man view of history and an embracing of the Marxist idea of historical materialism, the events of the movie very much fitting within that framework. At this point, I probably don't have to tell you the train is violently derailed. Not directly by the explosion, notably, but by the avalanche caused by it. Curtis and Nam's sacrifice successful, the children tentatively step out of the destroyed engine. All that remains is the answer to the question the movie has been asking for essentially its entire runtime. It all adds up to this. The question is, can humanity exist without capitalism? To which the movie dares to give the seemingly impossibly optimistic answer of yes. The importance of this yes cannot be overstated in the context of the movie's themes. The celebratory, triumphant nature of the music playing during the credits further confirms this yes. It's not so much a celebration of the triumph of the children surviving the crash, but the final proof that the late-stage capitalist ideology of the train was bankrupt, and symbolically, that there is a chance for something new outside it. The living polar bear even reveals the opening framing of the movie itself to be untrue. This false framing, a metatextual signifier for the overwhelming strength of the dominant ideology. What I find so striking about this ending is that it flies in the face of all the cruelty, all of the sacrifices done ostensibly in the name of the train that we bore witness to. In this ultimate rebuke, none of it needed to happen. And this is despite the privileged buying deeply into the ideology of the train and leveraging all the tools at their disposal to reinforce it. It is an important reminder that just because an ideology is dominant among the ruling class does not make it inevitable nor just. The revelation that life outside the train is possible also recharacterizes all of the sacrifices made from being made in the name of preserving humanity to merely preserving the social position of those atop the hierarchy. Given the real-life death and suffering inflicted on people in the name of something as trivial as the already wealthy making yet more money, this pushes the critique of the movie further still. Unlike Snowpiercer, it didn't take a darkening of the sky for us to instrumentalize and sacrifice our fellow humans. Yet those who currently shape the political and economic world want their actions to be viewed as inevitable and needed to maintain society. Snowpiercer is directly questioning this. Adjacent to this question of the potential for humanity to exist outside of capitalism is a darker corollary question also asked by the movie. What will it cost to find out? The gravity of these stakes are established from the very first moment of Curtis's rebellion. In grabbing the guard's gun, pointing it to his head, and pulling the trigger, he is making a definitive statement. I would rather die than continue to live like this. It is exactly that same sentiment at play at the end of the movie when Curtis grants Yona the matches to light the bomb. Their actions could very well have resulted in the immediate extinction of humanity, yet the horrors Curtis witnessed instilled in him the needed fervor to roll the dice. Even if the outside world turned out to be utterly inhospitable, though, Curtis would have likely been satisfied with the outcome of his choice relative to letting the system continue. It is not entirely unlike a question posed by Zardoz. At what point is it no longer morally worth it to maintain a civilization?
Zardoz speaks to you.
Things are bad for a great many people, despite the ever-expanding mountain of puffery to the contrary. You don't need me to tell you that. Yet I still don't think we're anywhere near any kind of vaunted revolution, especially not one with a leftward velocity. How could there be a leftward movement in a country that has little meaningful understanding of a left perspective at all? Moreover, frankly, I have a hard time believing people are willing to put their lives on the line. To me, Snowpiercer serves as a reminder of the costs of such things, displayed honestly. Curtis lost his life, as did many, many others. There may come a day when a critical mass of people agree with the statement, "I would rather die than continue to live like this," and dedicate themselves to revolutionary fervor. But given the comfortable and privileged position of so many enjoying the spoils of the current system, however slight their individual pieces, I just don't see it anytime soon. Regardless, Snowpiercer dares to dream of a revolution. Not merely a false and controlled revolution, but a meaningful shift in society. It's a reminder that there is always room for hope. An ultimate escape from contemporary capitalism that I can't really think of terribly many other meaningful examples of in cinema. Maybe the last scene of The Apple? I'd love to hear your favorite contemporarily set revolutionary movies in the comments if you've got any. In the absence of engaging with the movie on the thematic level required to appreciate the ending, it can be easy to see why many dislike it. On my first time watching, I'll confess to being somewhat put off that it ended where it did. While I see now the inherent catharsis of the children stepping out into the world outside the train, it's admittedly hard to imagine their lives afterward. Because of this, I bet some people may have preferred an ending where they come across a snow ridge and find a whole city of people, or perhaps a more socialist train on a separate network. But the point of the final scene is ultimately to demonstrate that there is plenty of room for hope. Hope for them, and on a long enough timeline, perhaps hope for us too. Now I do have to quickly mention the show, if not just because there's a non-zero chance that you're watching this video because it showed up as a related video to something involving it. Admittedly, I haven't seen much of it. The first episode wasn't quite as dire as I had feared, though. It didn't center the bouge at the front of the train nearly as much as I thought it would, although it was still a considerable perspective shift. The show tells a strikingly different story from the movie, focused entirely within the train with no thought to the outside. Without that systematically transgressive element, it just doesn't seem that special, considering that the vast majority of media takes place in some kind of capitalist society, even if this one is a train. Although it is nice to see some acknowledgement of the role class plays in society at least. Also, Wilford is a girl boss now, I guess? Regardless, if enough people recommend it, I might check more of it out, or even do a video on it. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.